Continuing on with the trunk parameters, the next thing I have is the waviness of the trunk. So in order to see this properly, I'm going to tone down the turbulence. This will give me a straight trunk. And I can play with the waves in X. So along the X axis, which is this axis here, I'm going to have waviness, and I can do the same thing for the Z axis. If I want to have a perfect circle or a perfect helix, I can set both these values to the same amount. For example, 20 by 20, and this is what I have. And I can also change the scale of that. Now, if I did not want to have the bottom side of the trunk to be so deformed, I can increase the deform bias, and this will make just the tip of the trunk have this deformation. Okay, so you can have control like this to make the bottom of the trunk go like that. Okay, so I'll reset this. By the way, before I continue, you can have the waves go in a clockwise or counterclockwise fashion. Alright, so bringing back the waves to zero, we now talk about the turbulence. This will actually turbulize the trunk to give it a more natural appearance. Now, the turbulence works always in conjunction with the turbulence scale. So if you reduce the scale, you're going to have more detail. And if you increase the scale, the detail is going to be larger. So combining this with the trunk displacement features, you can have a very detailed trunk. Sometimes you want to fade out the turbulence at the top, and this is what the fade turbulence at the top parameter is doing. So if you reduce that, then the turbulence is inherited all the way through up to the tip of the trunk. So this will have the trunk be horizontal, for example, at the top, while you can just make it vertical by increasing that value. And you can control this by changing the fade bias. So you can have it more vertical all the way down to the bottom by changing the fade bias value. To have a better view of the bending, I'm gonna reduce the turbulence to have a straight trunk, and here I will change the bending of the trunk, and of course I can change the direction, but we have the bend power as well. So if I increase the power, then the trunk bending is going to happen only along the tip of the trunk, and increasing this value will make the trunk coil on itself, which gives you a very nice spirally appearance. This, of course, will affect any branches that are hung onto the trunk. For example, if I go to display the branches, now here the branches do not take the orientation of the trunk because that's the option that is set under orient to trunk. But if I did increase that value, then the branches do take that orientation. So if I go back to the trunk parameters and I change back the bending, I'll see that the branches would apply. Okay, so this is for the bending of the trunk, very powerful and very controllable. Okay, so let's deactivate the branches again and move on to the next set of parameters. Starting with the twist cross-section, which you have seen earlier, which is a very powerful feature, especially when combined with displacement. Of course, the actual texture will twist as well. So if I go back and show the texture in detail, okay, here I'm gonna reduce the tiling of that texture, say to 3 in U and 1 in V. Okay, so if I go back and twist the trunk, I see that the texture along with any deformation will be twisting as well. Alright, the flare count, these are the flares down here. You can increase and decrease. Now, if you set them to 1, you still see something happening. If you did not want to see that, you just reduce the strength down to 0. So these are the flares. Of course, they're over-exaggerated right now. Okay, so I changed the color of the materials so that we can see things more clearly. Now, the flare count, as I was saying, are these. Now, if you increase them, you need to have more segments or more sides actually to see the detail properly. So I'm going to increase the sides, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to increase the flares that much, but this is how you can control the flares. Flare strength is how far they go out of the trunk, and the root flare bias is how far they go up the height of the trunk, right? So if you increase this value, you're gonna restrict the flares to be displayed or to be available at the very bottom. Decreasing that value will raise the flares up the height of the trunk. Okay, so next we have the custom trunk cross section. For that, we need to draw a curve in the top view that will become the cross section of the trunk. So let's draw something that goes like this. And what I'm gonna do is go back to the trunk and add this curve in the cross section link entry over here. So I'm gonna drag it down. So far nothing happens because I have to activate use custom cross section, and whenever I do that, I'm gonna get the trunk to take this orientation. Okay, now when I look at the trunk, I see that it's wrong. It's taking the wrong orientation for the curve, and this is because of the way I drew the curve. So I drew the curve in a clockwise manner, and this is giving me the wrong orientation for the curve. To solve this problem, all I have to do is check reverse cross section, and this will give me the proper orientation. Now I still see some twisting happening. If you just rotate the curve, nothing will happen, but if you do rotate the points of the curve, then you can unwind the twisting like so. So now the curve goes like this, and if you want to have a perfect match, you can just rotate that curve, in this case 180 degree at the object level, and then you will see that you have the perfect match like so. Okay, now from here on, just changing the points of the curve will have a direct effect on the trunk. So if I just selected this point here and moved it, it will affect the trunk cross section. So let's select a few points and move them around, and this will have a direct effect on the trunk. Now, if you look here, you see that you have stretching for the texture. If I go back to my spline, I can actually close it. It will do a good job of fixing the UVs, but you have another thing you can do, because the density of the polygons is not uniform. So what you would do in this case is choose normalize cross-section spline. So if I deselected the tree just to see this happening properly, if I check the normalized cross-section, I will get a uniform distribution of the segments and also of the UVs, right? So checking this value will normalize the segment distribution and the UV distribution. You can also play with the iterations value. If you increase that, you're gonna get a more faithful adaptation to the original shape of the curve. All right, you can have the cross-section rise across the trunk. If you decrease that value, you would have the cross-section be inherited all across the height of the trunk. Increasing that value will restrict the cross-section to the bottom of the trunk. So this will give you control over the shape of the trunk cross section. Note that whenever you are using a custom cross section, the flares are not considered, because the point of creating or using your own curve is to actually design the shape of the flares, which you don't want to be uniform. The next parameter I want to talk about is the use of the custom trunk spline. For this, I'm going to go to my front view, and I'm going to draw a spline like so. So if I wanted this to be my trunk, first of all, let's make sure that this is not really a two-dimensional curve. So I'm gonna just go like this, and just make sure that it's a 3D curve like so. So I'm gonna call this spline trunk spline. Going back down here, I'm gonna drag the trunk spline under trunk custom spline, and I'm gonna check this, and this will actually make the trunk take that spline. In this case, it's also taking the cross section. Now, to make the trunk stay at the base, this has to do with the actual curve rather than the trunk. So to fix this problem, I would go to my center and set the center value to 0 and 0, and this will actually solve my problem. Then you would change the adjust height value from here. It will keep the trunk constrained, and it will also make it adapt itself properly to that curve. Needless to say that this is also propagated with the branches. I think I've covered all the parameters that we have under the trunk parameters. In the next video, I'm going to talk about the attachments section.